Why, hello there. Thanks for visiting. So what we're going to cover in this video is how we use auth context, and we've used API routes to go ahead and make sure this user information in the top always gets updated when the user signs in and signs out. So just a quick example, user's going to sign in, the session's going to pop in here. This is a cookie, so you see there. So we get all this user information that's passed up from context provider and the API routes. If we log out, that session cookie disappears. And now it's time to dive into the code. So let's start at the very beginning in our layout component. So if you're not familiar with Next.js 15 and layout is really handy because what this means is you can set up your navbar, you can set up your footer if you have a footer, and it's going to have that same layout throughout your application. So you're not re-importing the navbar every time you make a new page. It's just going to be that layout shared throughout your entire application. You can have multiple layouts if you want, but for this one, this isn't the root, so this is going to be the main layout we have. So for this, what's important here for our conversation today is the user provider. So this is actually part of React context. If you're not familiar with React context, think of it as basically a picnic basket. So everyone that's at that picnic can go ahead and grab whatever data they need, those people being components in this example, and grab like the user profile image, the user's display name, and hey, to use that information themselves. Otherwise, if you don't have React context, you have to manually get that information, and then you would have to prop drill it. So the parent component can pass it to the can prop drill it to the components inside of it, and it just requires a lot of code and get messy. So the context provider is very helpful for that. Of course, you have to be careful with it. You don't want to put everything in React context. You know, it sounds great because everything that uses that context in some way will re-render whenever that value changes. So if it's used heavily throughout your app, a lot of things are going to be re-rendering that maybe you don't need to. So it's best to limit it to data that you know everywhere is going to need, such as this sample. It's going to be the user information, that profile image, the display name. So, and for here, one important thing, if you are in Next.js 15, this is a server component by default. The React context is always going to be a client component, so we had to make a little wrapper. So this is actually a client component we import into that server component. So that way this can still be rendered on the server because it's just importing that client component to load later. So let's dive into the React context. So for this, what we have down here is a handy little fella called the use effect. So what this does, if you're not familiar, is it says, hey, when this component renders, which in this case is the entire application, run this function, and also if trigger recheck changes, go ahead and run this again. So for this, what it's going to do inside here is we're going to do get user's ID. So get user's ID is going to be right here. And this is going to make an API fetch call to sign in users. We're going to go ahead and turn that into JSON. We're going to go ahead and then grab the user property. And then down here, we're going to grab the user's ID property from that. And that's what we're going to return at the very end of this function. So that's going to be put over here. That's going to store it into this variable here. Then we're going to run a different function. Once that one's done, we're going to run get user info. We're going to pass in that information to it. Get user's info is actually right underneath that previous function we had. So what it's going to do is going to get that user ID. It's going to run it to our API call down here. API users get specific user and put the user ID right in there. When that's done, we're going to go ahead and get that user object back, get the part of it we need, return that user. And one thing too is we're going to go ahead and for that information we get back from that second function, we're going to go ahead and pass it to our update context with user info function, which then updates context. We put that value into the picnic basket, and now everywhere in our app can go ahead and use that value. So if you have a good eye, you might have noticed something. So here, if you look here, you'll see, wait, you got a user object back. Why are you calling the user object yet again down here? that's an unnecessary API call, you might think. Well, let's go back to Appwrite to go ahead and explain what's happening. So for this, we have the auth users, which are great. This is all going to be information that the users can access about their account. But the con is this is all private information. What if you want to go ahead and share someone's profile image, their username? Then you can't access this because this is going to be personalized to that logged in user with that session. So let's go over here. What we have instead, we have a database full of users. So they're going to go ahead and have information that's going to be public. So, and one thing that's important too is when the user got created, you see this user's ID right here, the auth ID. It's going to be the same as the user's ID in our database. So we set up there, that was easy lookup. And I may be worried, wait, why the ID? Isn't that going to be unsafe? Well, the reason why it's safe is that they can't really do much with auth with just the auth ID. What you need to access the auth information is a valid session. So you'd have to be signed in, you'd have to have a valid session value that matches what's in the database. So just on the ID, not a safety risk, since it's not going to be passing the session value, it's just that ID that has to be related to that auth account. So let's go ahead and dive more into the APIs. So for this, an important note if you're coming from a MERN-stack background or if you just use Express in general, is that it's going to be a little different than you expect. So with Express, you're going to get a request and a response object. However, with the standard Web Fetch API handler, it only has a request object. So just a heads up, so you're not surprised when that happens. So let's go down here. So we see that create session client again. So you go, hey, I see there's no session cookie put in there. And you'd be right. And the reason for this is all public information. We're describing the user's profile image, the user's display name. There's no special permissions for this. In other parts of the app where I had only specific users that created a post, I let them edit their own post. Then I had to go ahead and again create a validated client, grab the cookie, put that in there. But in this case, this is just regular read. Everyone could read these documents. There's no limitations to who could read it. So we can just keep it nice and easy and just have an unvalidated client here. So first off, we need to get that user ID that we passed over here again. So that user ID is, we have to do request JSON first, then go to the body, grab the user's ID, want to make sure it's a string, and then for this, we can go to Appwrite, tell it, hey, go to your databases and get a specific document. So this is current target ID, so we're saying grab that document with this ID. And for this, I'm telling it, hey, only send me this information back. I don't care about anything else. But even though I say that, Appwrite does still send some extra information with the object. There's a lot of information I don't need specifically, so I go ahead and trim that. That's what this is doing down here. Not too important, so I'm not going to go into details. And then for here, we have the response object. We're going to do response JSON, put the trimmed user object in there. And one thing for this is you can go ahead and put some sort of JSON serializable value in here. In the second argument, you can go ahead, put like a status text, and headers. For my application, for this part of it, I found it easier for this use case to just have an object that, for example, might have an error value and a message value if it fails. And that way, because I'm going to be showing that information to the user, I didn't really need the status information for this object. If you do prefer that in your app, you can go ahead and add that in there if you'd rather have that for your logic. I just found this was the most logical method for me. So let's go ahead and summarize what happened. So we're going to go ahead and log in. When we log in, we're going to use that session cookie, and we're going to make 2 API calls. The end result is we're going to get that public user information, such as the username, the user profile image. It's going to update the navbar, and it's also going to update anything else in the app that wants to use that information from context. And for this first API call, quick summary, we're just going to go ahead and call auth, grab that ID, and then the second API call, we're going to grab that ID and ask it, hey, go to database. go to the users and find me a document that matches this ID, and then send me the public information back. And then for this, if we also log out, it'll update, and the reason why that updated is this value here, trigger recheck got called. I'm going to go into details of that because that's beyond the scope of this, but that's why backend update, and again it triggers these API calls to happen again. It sees that there's no valid session, so it clears it, changes it to the normal guest value, and that's pretty much it. Thank you for listening, and hope you have a good one.